He stood looking at the whiskey. Then he took his hat off and placed it on the bar and took up the glass and drank it very deliberately and set the empty glass down again. He wiped his mouth and turned around and placed his elbows on the bar behind him. Watching him across the layered smoke and the yellow light was the judge. He was sitting at one of the tables. He wore a round hat with a narrow brim, and he was among every kind of man, herder and bullwhacker and drover and freighter and miner and hunter and soldier and peddler and gambler and drifter and drunkard and thief, and he was among the dregs of the earth in beggary 1,000 years, and he was among the scapegrace scions of eastern dynasties, and in all that motley assemblage he sat by them, and yet alone, as if he were some other sort of man entire, and he seemed little changed or none in all these years. He turned away from those eyes and stood looking down at the empty tumbler between his fists. When he looked up, the barman was watching him. He raised his forefinger, and the barman brought the whiskey. He paid, he lifted the glass and drank. There was a mirror along the back bar, but it held only smoke and phantoms. The barrel organ was groaning and creaking, and the bear with tongue a-loll was revolving heavily on the boards. When he turned, the judge had risen and was speaking with other men. The showman made his way through the throng, shaking the coins in his hat. Garishly clad whores were going out through a door at the rear of the premises, and he watched them, and he watched the bear, and when he looked back across the room, the judge was not there. The showman seemed to be in altercation with the man standing at the table. Another man rose. The showman gestured with his hat. One of them pointed toward the bar. He shook his head. Their voices were incoherent in the din. On the boards, the bear was dancing for all that his heart was worth, and the girl cranked the organ handle, and the shadow of the act which the candlelight constructed upon the wall might have gone begging for reference in any daylight world. When he looked back, the showman had donned the hat, and he stood with his hands on his hips. One of the men had drawn a long-barreled cavalry pistol from his belt. He turned and leveled the pistol toward the stage. Some dove for the floor. Some reached for their own arms. The owner of the bear stood like a pitchman at a shooting gallery. The shot was thunderous, and in the afterclap all sound in that room ceased. The bear had been shot through the midsection. He let out a low moan, and he began to dance faster, dancing in silence save for the slap of his great footpads on the planks. Blood was running down his groin. The little girl strapped into the barrel organ stood frozen, the crank at rest on the upswing. The man with the pistol fired again, and the pistol bucked and roared, and the black smoke rolled, and the bear groaned and began to reel drunkenly. He was holding his chest, and a thin foam of blood swung from his jaw, and he began to totter and to cry like a child, and he took a few last steps, dancing, and crashed to the boards. Someone had seized the pistol arm of the man who'd done the shooting, and the gun was waving aloft. The owner of the bear stood stunned, clutching the brim of his old-world hat. "Shot the goddamned bear," said the barman. The little girl had unbuckled herself out of the barrel organ, and it clattered wheezing to the floor. She ran forward and knelt and gathered the great shaggy head up in her arms, and began to rock back and forth, sobbing. Most of the men in the room had risen, and they stood in the smoky yellow space with their hands on their sidearms. Whole flocks of whores were scuttling toward the rear, and a woman mounted to the boards and stepped past the bear and held out her hands. "It's all over," she said. "It's all over. Do you believe it's all over, son?" He turned